In my last videos about Myanmar, I spoke about how Aung San Suu Kyi staged peaceful pro-democracy protests and became a darling of the international community. In this one, I talk about how the hope that she inspired was, according to some people at least, squandered. Her international standing was damaged by her response to the Rohingya Genocide in the northern Rakhine state, the most serious of a series of human rights violations committed by the government while her party held office from 2016 until the recent coup. Her defenders will say that she did this because the military still holds a lot of power, but others say that she let her principles down. The truth is that we'll never really know for sure, but the case of Aung San Suu Kyi is an interesting one because how can someone who was so lauded for their efforts to world peace and to democracy fall so far? And should we be blaming her for this, or should we instead blame the military? Between 1988 and 2011, Aung San Suu Kyi spent most of her time under house arrest for her opposition to the military, also known as the Talmudor. After she was released, the Talmudor and their supposed civilian wing, the USDP, allowed her party, the NLD, to run in by-elections and in the 2015 general election. 2015 was the first election in Myanmar since 1960, which was even close to democratic, and the NLD won it in a landslide. However, the Talmudor still held a considerable amount of power. They were able to appoint a quarter of MPs to Parliament, which gave them a total veto on constitutional matters. They had power to appoint the cabinet positions of Home Affairs, of Defence and of Border Controls, and they also had the power to dismiss Parliament if they didn't like what was going on, which is theoretically what they took advantage of in the recent coup. What's more, the constitution had a not so subtle amendment to block Aung San Suu Kyi from the presidency, as it bans those with a foreign spouse or children from the position. The NLD wanted Aung San Suu Kyi in control, so they made her the position of state councillor. So how did Aung San Suu Kyi wield this new power? Not very well. The Economist reported that the NLD's first budget wasn't actually all that different from the Talmudor's last one, suggesting that they didn't really have much of an agenda for change. And as well as this, they didn't really stand up to the human rights abuses of the Talmudor either, with Human Rights Watch saying that there was little in the way of substantive change to most of the laws against speech and assembly, and instead the NLD has done the opposite, strengthening some abusive laws and enacting at least one law imposing new restrictions on speech. And now a particularly prescient example of this came with the arrest of two journalists who were reporting on a part of the Rohingya genocide. Before we get to that, let's discuss what actually happened. The genocide took place in Rakhine State, a northern area bordering Bangladesh, and like most border states in Myanmar, Rakhine State has armed ethnic and separatist groups, with their two most important being the Rakhine Army and the much smaller, but if you believe the Talmudor, much more important, Rakhine Rohingya Salvation Army. The answers raise on Detra is the rights of Rohingya Muslims, who make up a third of the state's population. The government does not consider this group to be citizens, but instead so-called Bengali illegal immigrants, and this makes them a stateless group with very little in the way of rights provided by the government. We know for certain that the Rohingya have existed in Myanmar for hundreds of years. According to the New Yorker article, under the democratic government in the 40s and 50s, there were Rohingya serving in parliament, and they were also included in the 1961 census. But a racist citizenship law in 1982 recategorised them as Bengali aliens, and Rohingya could no longer attend the best schools, and those who could not afford to pay off local officials found their freedom to move around the country curtailed. It was under these conditions that ARSA was formed. They spoke publicly about their rights, with their leader quoted in the Asia Times saying they couldn't be immigrants because there is a heavy security force presence all along the border. So how is it that there are numbers of people who somehow manage to cross in? For another, why would anyone seek to migrate to what is in effect an open prison? On the 25th of August 2016, ARSA launched an attack on police outposts. The Talmudor used this as an excuse to strike back, and under their so-called clearance operations, they displaced 700,000 of the roughly 1 million Rohingya in Rakhine State. To give a sense of what an overreaction this is, estimates put the number of militants in ARSA at the time as being between 500 and 600, or roughly 0.05% of the total Rohingya population. In response to the actions of these 600 people, the Talmudor killed and raped 25,000, which is at least 41 times as many people as there were militants in ARSA. The 700,000 people that they displaced is well over half of even the highest estimates of the Rohingya population in Myanmar. Yet the Talmudor continued to use this attack as a justification for their actions against the Rohingya, claiming they were all terrorists or jihadists, and Bangladesh was forced to put these people into refugee camps, or at least they were until the 19th of March 2019 when they announced they weren't taking on any more. They did this because they claimed the Talmudor was not negotiating seriously about the return of these Rohingya to Myanmar, with their foreign secretary being quoted in the BBC as saying Bangladesh is paying the price for being responsive and responsible and showing empathy to a persecuted minority population. And Bangladesh was kind of right about the repatriation attempts, because this first batch would have only had 2,000 of the original 700,000 Rohingya returned to Myanmar, and obviously under pain of death, it's no surprise that none of them took them up on that, kind offer. What's more, the Talmudor had either sanctioned or turned a blind eye to the destruction of nearly a third of all Rohingya villages in Rakhine state, and the BBC had seen 4 locations where they'd built secure facilities and army bases on places where Rohingya people once lived. So, if they were trying to welcome them back into the country, they were doing a rubbish job of it. Now, obviously, the Talmudor will tell a different story. In November 2017, the Talmudor investigated themselves, and to the surprise of no one, found themselves not guilty, but a mixture of satellite images, interviews with survivors in Bangladesh, and some top-notch investigative journalism have contradicted this. The expressed opinion of some Burmese people has also given a shoddy image of their attitudes towards the Rohingya as well. In 2017, for example, the BBC interviewed a Talmudor colonel on the rape and killing of Rohingya, and the colonel responded by saying, "Where is the proof? Look at these women. Would anyone want to rape them?" This is unfortunately indicative of the general view in Myanmar towards the Rohingya, as when the current genocide happened, it was not just the Talmudor who were burning down Muslim villagers' houses, but also non-Muslim villagers as well, and this is sort of like, a recurring theme throughout the history of the Rohingya. The last time violence like this happened was in 2012, when 3 Muslim men were accused of raping a Buddhist woman, and Buddhist villagers responded by killing 10 Muslims, the Muslims responded by killing 7 Buddhists, and this essentially continued until we had a smaller scale version of what's happening right now, with Rohingya left in what's been described as open air prisons without access to education, healthcare or electricity. What's more, the BBC did an article where they looked at the Facebook pages of Burmese people, and they saw a lot of hatred about Rohingya people swirling around there, including the use of a racial slur, which is apparently the same as the Burmese for chickpea, and therefore, Facebook couldn't actually crack down on it. Now, this isn't really all that surprising, considering that Myanmar is a country where there's always been a lot of ethnic tension, particularly since independence from the British in the 1940s, but this does seem to be particularly vicious towards the Rohingya. Now, you've probably noticed that in this video I haven't mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi all that much, but that's just because, with the Talmudor having control over the police, the military and the border, she didn't actually do much in instigating the crisis. However, that doesn't mean that she should be absolved from blame, because as we'll see, some of her actions and inactions, they didn't really help the situation, whether they made them worse or not. Before 2016, there were already hints that Aung San Suu Kyi would not be entirely sympathetic towards the Rohingya cause. For example, Human Rights Watch flagged up in 2012 that when asked about the crisis in that year, she said that it was based on a climate of fear, and that when asked about the 140,000 Muslims who'd have to flee their home during that crisis, she said that many Buddhists had to flee Burma as well. Now, obviously, this is a pretty big hint as to how she was going to react to something like this happening, but with Burma democratizing at the time, it probably just flew under the radar. When the genocide started, she initially stayed silent, and she only broke this silence when she made a speech in the Myanmar capital, which sided with the military. In her appearance at the International Court of Justice, she referred to the genocide as an internal conflict, and only used the word Rohingya in reference to ARSA. She was also silent on human rights abuses against Burmans. An example of this is on the 2 Reuters journalists who were investigating the Indin massacre, a massacre where 10 Rakhine villagers were killed by the Talmudor and by some Buddhist villagers. The Talmudor claims this is because they came under attack while in this village, but this is not corroborated either by refugees in the Bangladeshi refugee camps, nor by the actual other non-Muslim villagers who live in that area. We wouldn't even know this had happened were it not for the Reuters investigation, but the two men were arrested for their efforts. They arranged to meet two police officers in a restaurant who handed them secret documents, but when they walked outside, they were met by two other police officers who arrested them for holding these documents, and then they were sentenced to 7 years under a colonial era secrets law. And they didn't serve all of this, but that's no thanks to Aung San Suu Kyi, who did not defend them at all. Given all of this, how did Aung San Suu Kyi win re-election in 2020? Well, for starters, it was a choice between her party and the Talmudor, so, there wasn't really much choice at all. And also, according to Channel News Asia, the pandemic brought the need for a strong and stable government into sharper focus and worked to the NLD government's advantage as voters became increasingly concerned about livelihoods and lives. Those who are sympathetic to her also point out that the Talmudor were really the ones in control, so she doesn't seem to have much wiggle room, or at least she didn't. As you all know, on the 1st of February this year, there was a coup d'etat against the democratic government of Myanmar, with Aung San Suu Kyi removed from power and arrested. Why this happened doesn't seem clear, but shedding her human rights credentials to defend the Talmudor wasn't enough to prevent a coup.